Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. Remember, this podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. So Early Childhood Ireland members will know that children's rights, safeguarding are central to our work, and we know that our members also are really passionate about enshrining this in their work with children. Regular listeners to the podcast will have heard episodes in the past about developing child safeguarding statements, empowering children's participation rights, consulting with children and so on. So carrying forward that theme for this episode, I'm really very pleased to be joined by Tanya Ward, CEO of the Children's Rights Alliance. Early Childhood Ireland is a proud member of the Alliance. And Tanya has been working with the Children's Rights Alliance since 2012. Before that, she worked with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and the Irish Refugee Council. She's currently president of Eurochild and an ordinary member of the new Just Transition Commission. She's a former chair of the National Advisory Council for Children and Youth Affairs. So, Tanya, you're really most welcome, and thank you for taking the time to have this important conversation about children's rights, participation, and keeping children safe.
Yeah, thank you. Delighted to be part of the podcast.
So the Children's Rights Alliance, just for a little bit of background, was founded in 1995 and it's made up of 160 member groups who work to change the lives of all children and young people in Ireland by making sure their rights are respected and protected in laws, services, policies, and so on. So in preparation for this conversation, I was looking at the Children's Rights Alliance website, and there's 7 strategic policies and priorities for the Alliance are outlined there. So I thought, if it's okay with you, Tanya, that we could delve into some of those a little bit. And I thought the first was a good place to start. So, that area of fostering children's rights. So, what achievements and progress have we made in Ireland in regard to fostering children's rights?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question because obviously if you want to make sure that children's rights are protected, you have to start with culture and behaviour. And I suppose one of the things that is important to acknowledge is, Ireland is actually seen as a leader when it comes to children's rights. Now, I'm sure there are many people out there that will say, how on earth is that the case? Because you'll see that there's a lot of different really important strategic work taking place, but of course there's a lot of children who can't get access to supports. They can't get school places. A lot of children in poverty, a lot of children living in places like direct provision, a lot of children experiencing racism and discrimination. So it's really a tale of two halves, really, when it comes to Ireland. So where we've done really well is we've been very good at kind of building institutional infrastructure and finding ways to support and promote the voice of children and young people. So an example of that is, Ireland is only the second country to establish an Ombudsman for Children's Office. And I know my predecessor, Ray Dooley, one of the things he would have done as the first CEO of Children's Rights Alliance, every time a very serious report came out from government or from a review, and it was particularly in the child protection area, to be honest, because in around that time after the Children's Rights Alliance is founded, it's becoming pretty clear that children were harmed in institutions that were set up to safeguard their rights. And I'm thinking about, you're thinking about institutions that would have featured in the Ryan report, but also it was becoming clear that actually children weren't safe in their home, and that quickly unraveled. Ray would have issued press releases every time a new announcement was made or a new story came to light that we need an ombudsman for children. And there was great leadership internally in government to get one established. And the ombudsman is really important because not only is the ombudsman actually entrusted with doing education nationally on what children's rights means on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, he also has a complaints function. And it means that if a child has an issue around maladministration or they have issues around accessing services, they can take a complaint to the Ombudsman for Children, and it's in relation to a public body. And he's able to investigate it, and then he's able to make a recommendation. And you do see, the Ombudsman playing a very particular role in relation to critical issues for children, really push the bar on ending children being detained in Mountjoy prison, really push the bar in addressing access to services for children with disability, really made a difference in bringing the voice of children experiencing homelessness to the fore, and kept a focal point in that area. The other things I think that are really important around this piece is all the great work that's been done to bring the voice of young people to the fore. So Ireland really, has had participation strategies that are far better than any other country in Europe, and a lot of expertise. Some of the best expertise around participation, I'm really proud to say, is actually in organisations like yourselves and Bernardo's and Feroga, National Youth Council of Ireland, for example, and that is deliberate because there has been this national focus on participation, funding support for organisation to develop their participation skills, working with children and young people. So not only, let's say, finding ways to listen to the voice of children and young people and trying to engage them in decision making, but also developing their skills to be able to participate effectively in different types of initiatives. I think it's really successful that we have, or one of the reasons successful things government is doing is the Corlin and Oaks. So the fact that there's a youth parliament, and there's examples of that now emerging. There's a climate parliament. There's also one being established around transport as well. So it's a really great model. And then you get pockets of very good practice that's taking place. So one of the good examples would be, for example, EPIC is funded by TUSLA to work with young people in the care system, but their young people have a very privileged access to TUSLA and help shape the decisions that TUSLA would be making. So there's some very good practice that's taken place. On the negative, though, right,
Yes.
I would say, is that unfortunately, this is not national it's not national. Many decisions are being made about children, and children's rights aren't taken into account. And there are many situations where, and COVID is a prime example of it, while there might have been discussions about children, they did not adopt a children's rights approach when they were deciding what to open, what to close, for example. And what that would mean is, for example, you'd have maybe a list of questions you deploy when you're trying to make a decision about how to protect children and young people. You might involve some way to engage children and young people themselves to shape that decision. And that's, I suppose, where we need to go next as a country, really, is to make sure that anyone who has any responsibility for services for children and young people who are making national policy decisions are thinking about their rights from the very outset. And I think one thing that's really positive is the government has a new strategy, Young Ireland. It has a very strong section actually on children's rights, and a focus around, yes, we need to educate public servants and advice givers and people who are working with children around children's rights. So that's an important thread coming through. But also they commit to doing pilot work around child rights impact assessments. And so, for example, I know that they are talking with the Department of Education to look at senior cycle and doing a child rights impact assessment there. I think that's would be a really positive development, because the Leaving Cert is casts such a shadow on the education system. So bringing those young people together and to unravel what's going on for them and trying to come up with an alternative will be really important, particularly because all the vested interests, no one wants to change it. Everyone wants to keep it the way it is. They all think it's brilliant. So those kind of things I think are going to be very important. And then, it has to be said, regulation is incredibly important in the protection and promotion of children's rights, and translating rights into law. So, there are rights for children, let's say in education, in the Education Act. We don't have access yet or entitlement to early years education, but I know that's something the government is exploring. The early years inspectorate is playing a very important role in safeguarding children's rights in early years services. TUSLA obviously has a role as well to, look at safeguarding statements and see whether they comply with the standards that they put together. So all of these things, they all work together to promote a children's rights culture, but we have a long way to go, to be honest, for it to really embed and for all children and young people to experience those kind of changes that we need to see happen. But I do think life is much better for children and young people born today than it would have been 50 years ago or 40 years ago.
One of the things that strikes me is how much harder it is to talk about children's rights in relation to younger children. It's like, it's something, and, participation can be harder with younger children. Consultation can be harder with younger children, but that's not a reason to not do it or ignore it. Of course, as children get older, they're generally more articulate, and we'll come to disabilities and so on in a minute, but it's like, the older they get, the more their rights can be enshrined, and that it can be lip service for younger children or children who find it more difficult to participate and be involved. So you've mentioned about the laws and policy and practice. And I was wondering, do you think we're kind of better at the policy and not so good at the practice? Do we kind of pay lip service to the idea of children's rights across the board, or is practice kind of catching up with the policy and laws?
I mean, I'd say, so if you look at where children's rights kind of translated at this moment in time, so it's in lots of different places, in a piecemeal kind of way, to be honest. So you've got some within the Education Act and some of the education legislation, some in social protection legislation. You've got some of it in the Children and Family Relationships Act that establishes TUSLA. You've some of the Children and Family Relationships the Child and Family Agency Act that established TUSLA, and the Children and Family Relationships Act in relation to family relationships. So it happens, when it does happen, it happens in a piecemeal way. What government doesn't do really effectively, and what it should do, is every time it's passing laws, is look at, well, what rights do we need to put into our legislation? So that doesn't happen, and it usually happens because there's a really good, dedicated civil servant in a government department that wants to make it happen, or there's a core relationship, or there's a minister who's very interested. So that's kind of how it happens in legislation. Saying that, by and large, I would say at this point in time, I meet a lot of people in public policy who aren't as keen on legislation, because I suppose the two reasons is, one, litigation. There's real fear around litigation, because usually people take cases and their rights aren't protected, and usually it's the same civil servant that's kind of trying to uphold or manage a failing system, and then they have to manage litigation, so their experience is negative. And then other times they'll say the legislation is not it gets out of date very quickly, and that's why it doesn't work. I mean, as a human rights campaigner, you would always say legislation is absolutely vital, because part of having a rights-based approach is you have an access to a remedy, you have somewhere to make a complaint, you can go to court, have your rights protected. So that is an important part of it. So we're not as good on legislation as we should be. We're probably a bit better on policy, actually, right? And again, you see the policy children's rights coming in because there's a good civil servant who's really committed. Now, I have to say, one of the game changers in Ireland has been the fact we've had a Department of Children, and you have people who came into participation in children's rights who really believed in this, and they had long, strong track records, either in public service or they had worked in one of the organisations that we would all know, and they really want to bed these things down. So that as that leadership and capacity and competency that emerged has been actually really important. And you'll find often behind all of these really successful initiatives has been someone like that they made it happen. Where I think we don't do well is, we don't do well in kind of every other government department taking the same approach. So, if you take the Department of Housing, for example, for many years, they did not record children as children, they were dependents. And they did not apply a rights-based approach when they're designing their policy or emergency accommodation and all the things that children need, can refuse to take it on board. So it's not our job. We can't cope anyway, so we're not going to take it on board. That's where legislation should change that, where you've got that kind of attitude. And I suppose what the Department of Children is hoping to achieve is with those child rights impact assessments is that will be a way of unlocking those government departments who don't see it as their job, basically. But one area where you see definitely a shift happening in that area is in relation to Department of Education. So now it has its own participation unit. It has done a children's rights audit of education. It's starting to develop, its work in that area. So things are changing, but it can be slow. And, it just so happens that the Secretary General has come from the Department of Children. So you can see how that culture does matter. And then sometimes they get to move to other places and make a difference. Where I am deeply concerned, I suppose, when it comes to housing costs and the impact on poverty. And I think the government has done a lot when it's come to poverty, but it just hasn't done enough, hasn't dealt with the housing crisis, these big issues which are eroding people's incomes at home and exposing children to very harmful environments, sometimes in overcrowded conditions or in homeless accommodation. And where I have real frustration is in relation to child protection area and in relation to disability services. And in both circumstances, the reason for children not getting access to services they need is we have, as a country, we haven't planned our children's services effectively in line with the population. We haven't, I think education has done it, and it's always been part of the way they do it, although they still can't get the money they need to invest in education. That's another utter frustration, I have to say, But in other government departments, there's been a lack of planning. We're going to need all these occupational therapists, actually, based on the population growth. That's the bit that has been missing. And as a result, doesn't even matter if you put these rights into law, there's still no service to deliver them. And I think there are some of the real challenges that we face. I think the only way out of it is being really focused and working collectively with government, with stakeholders, on trying to unlock and address each of these different issues. I think the big challenge for me as a campaigner is, what is it you focus on? Because I know when we see change happen, it's usually 50, 60, 70 interventions has led to the change. That's why it's happened. And then if you put that kind of focus into something, it means something else. You don't put it into something else and something else suffers. So it's a hard thing, I suppose, as a campaigner in this space. But I'm really optimistic about what's possible, and I always am, because I consistently see things improve for children and young people.
Yeah, for me, it's things like the duration. So you mentioned homelessness and emergency accommodation and the inappropriateness of it. And then it's the length of time that some children, many children are in those kinds of situations that, what might be acceptable in an emergency situation for short term becomes completely unacceptable. Ideal world, it's never acceptable. But when children are in those kinds of situations for years on end, and be it direct provision, homelessness, whatever, that length of time, it's just completely unacceptable. You've touched on some of it already. We talked about the work on best practice on children's participation, and that it can be in legislation, it can be a bit piecemeal in embedding children's rights. Kind of moving that forward, how do you feel we can ensure that children in all contexts are involved and enabled to participate and have a voice, and ensuring that the highest possible levels of safeguarding are in place for children, in all contexts? I'd love to hear what your thoughts on that.
I mean, I love the way you started off with talking about young children and thinking about actually all children along the life spectrum should have a chance to contribute and frame and shape the decisions that are made in relation to them. And I think some of the high points in Ireland has been there have been consultations done by early years providers. I know we did a report for the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. Early Childhood Ireland worked with its members to do a big consultation with children around the country. The Department of Children commissioned consultations for under threes and between 3 and 6, and they actually had some variation in what children wanted. That fed into the National Early Years Strategy. So, we should be, for big national policy developments, we should be doing, big corporate formal consultations where children get to shape what's happening. And the second thing then is in relation to everyday work. It should be part of everyday work, and we build it into everyday work and everyday practice. And I think part of that is us being trained, as professionals about how to communicate and talk to children at different age ranges. There's very good guidance from the European Commission on child-friendly language. It mostly covers 13 to 17-year-olds, but there's other kind of guidance when you're working with children at a younger age. And so, you need to learn how to talk to children. You need to learn how to listen to children as well, understand what it is that they are trying to say to you. And you need to look at previous kind of consultations to understand. Because I remember looking at the report that Early Childhood Ireland sent to us for that UN committee. And what was really interesting was so many of the children said, I love being with my mummy in the car. I love being at home playing with my daddy. And of course, if you look at some of the consultations, a big thing that comes through is children want to be with their families. Right? That comes through, and I could see it. I think that's what they're telling us, actually. So at the different age ranges, you need to be sophisticated to understand that. The other thing that's important is acting on it. So the government have adopted the Laura Lundy model, and that's the framework for which guides participation work. But you need to create opportunities for young people to have the voice, and children need to empower them. You also need to listen to what they have to say and act on it. And I think that's where we struggle sometimes, because sometimes the unvarnished truth, we're not able for it as well.
Yeah.
And so that's where we need to kind of be okay with what we're hearing, and we need to act on it, and we need to be accountable. We need to go back and explain if we did implement something, why we did, or if we didn't, why we didn't. And that's a really important part of that practice. We need to show, look, we've listened, it's been successful. It's very motivating for children and young people. And I think in institutions and organizations, if this is part of your line of work, it's a whole organization approach, really. We all do it. We do it in everyday work. I think that's really important. But you also talked about safeguarding, and I know this is a core objective for Early Childhood Ireland. And I do think, there's a real need to strengthen the work around safeguarding that's happening in Ireland at the moment. After the Ryan report, which looked at industrial abuse or abuse of children in industrial schools, there was a focus on children first legislation and guidelines and training, and the establishment of TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency. But actually, I think we need to take a fresh look at what we're doing around safeguarding, because at this moment in time, I think it's very focused on, yes, you have your safeguarding statement, you do with the training, and then you report to TUSLA. I think we need to take a fresh look at it, because I'm wondering how sophisticated the work is around safeguarding of children. I mean, young children, they are so vulnerable. They are absolutely so vulnerable. It's much more difficult for them to express their voice. Children who maybe if they have learning difficulties, or it can be more difficult to express the voice as well. Of course, they still do express their voice, but it's in a different way. And I suppose what our providers need to be, and practitioners need to be, is to understand their voice, because they are letting you know they've experienced harm, or there's something that's happening to them and they want it to stop, but they are doing it and explaining it to you in a different way. And that's where we need to do much more sophisticated training with practitioners and providers, and with parents, to be honest, to understand what children and young people are saying. And I think we need to be a much stronger work around prevention, basically, in our institutions as well. I'd love to see a national audit to look at, what are we doing to prevent children being exposed to violence? What kind of prevention methods are we putting in place to implement that? We don't have that approach actually in Ireland. It's very much after the event when it comes to child protection issues. I'd love to see it, a more positive approach in relation to it. But there has been great success in some of the work. I mean, I think the Stay Safe programme actually has been really successful. I was even thinking about a recent case that was reported of the teacher that was doing ballet dancing classes, and then I think it was a 9-year-old who he assaulted, and she had just done the Stay Safe programme. So she realised what had happened to her was wrong, and she was able to talk to her parents about what happened. So those kind of measures, they are incredibly important, and they do actually work. But I do think we need to re-promise nationally when it comes to safeguarding. We need to do a lot more work on it.
And we did research last year, and one of the themes that emerged was that it isn't a one-person job. It's everybody's responsibility, and that it's not a responsibility of in a setting context of the manager or the DLP or deputy DLP or whatever. That everybody has a role in keeping parents involved in that. Because it's that that synergy is vital, that everybody is, because a manager doesn't know what 18-month-old expresses when she arrives in her setting in the morning or whatever. And also that bit that you mentioned about different ways of expressing themselves, that also came out, that children don't have the words, but it doesn't mean they don't have the voice. Or they might speak a different language, they might be pre-verbal, they might be non-verbal, but they still have ways of telling us things if we. And one of the things tying into the update of Aistear is, there's an emphasis in the update of Aistear on slow relational pedagogy. And if educators are enabled to slow it down, they will be able to hear those voices more easily than if they're kind of harried and stressed and always moving on to the next thing. And that kind of brings us on to education, because one of your 7 strategic areas focuses on education, and you do make reference to the need for more investment in early years. From the Children's Rights Alliance, from that perspective, why do you feel it's important to have more investment in early years education, Tanya?
I mean, it frustrates me greatly that while there's been so much change and investment in early years education in Ireland, it's still not recognised in the same way as, let's say, primary school and secondary school, even though it's absolutely fundamental to the development of our children and young people. I think where the investment needs to go, obviously the government is committing to reduce childcare costs to €200. I think one of the ways to do that is to look at actually professionally recognising and paying the staff on the same way that we pay our primary school teachers. I mean, and it's crystal clear from a children's rights approach. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has said the most important thing when it comes to early years education is the person that works with your child. And they need to be trained, they need to be recognised, and they need to be paid effectively. And then then you'll get the right people providing early years services. We've done great work in trying to raise the qualifications. A lot of people have committed. They've gone and done the diplomas and certificates and degrees. And then we've just very low wages, and it's not really acceptable, and we're losing them from the service. So I think the investment really needs to start with the staff and make sure they're paid as public servants, to be honest. I think that's the next step. I'd also like to see investment in expanding where early years is available, the capital investment that needs to take place. We have all that Apple money, and they're talking about it going into infrastructure. It needs to go into early years services, to be honest, to make sure that wherever a child lives, they have an entitlement and they can get access to it. Like the waiting lists that are happening around the country. The fact that if you talk to particularly community services, they have no money to expand, even though they might love to do it. There's no possibility to do it. We need to be creating a lot of money to provide these services to expand, and we need to look at other opportunities as well. I mean, if you look at all the education settings, a lot of them have land attached to them. The ETBs have a lot of land and facilities as well. There's lots of different ways we could be building early years provision around the country, and they're the two kind of areas that I'd love to see this government actually tackle equality in provision. That's what children want. Try and stop people leaving the services and keep them. It's a good job. It's a really important job. Early years educators, and they have a particular personality. They love being with young children. And it's such a loss to lose them off to another sector. And I know a lot are going into primary school education, but at the same time, we should be making sure, every part of the country you live in, even in rural Ireland, you're going to have access to proximity to an early years service. And that's the goal where I think the government should be investing. And then down the road, like the benefits to the children, their experience of the world, being ready for school, doing well in school, but also for the economy down the road. The reason why all the foreign direct investment is here, they're there because we have, amazing staff, amazing people. That's the real attraction for them going forward as well. And that this is part of that story of how we have that economy and that workforce for the future.
And it's a phenomenal workforce. We've well rehearsed the need for pay and conditions in line with fellow graduates and so on. And still, every time we put up a webinar or a training opportunity, immediately people are booking in. They attend all kinds of conferences and seminars and symposia in their own time, after hours. The thirst for knowledge and progression is incredible, and it's well past time that was recognized in terms and conditions. Words are great. It's great to hear you recognized, but it needs to be in the cold hard cash.
Yeah, we failed them, to be honest, right? Because you make a deal with people. You say, look, if you go and get the degree, we create the opportunity, and yet we won't kind of pay, and you can't sustain. You're in it's very difficult in Ireland if you're on a lower income at the moment with the cost of living and the price of housing. You're making it nearly a luxury to stay in early year, serving the public through early years, and we need to change that
for sure. So just before we go, we kind of touched on disability, and we kind of started talking about inclusion. And you were saying about education, and that we're doing quite well in some areas. Do you feel disability is an area that needs a lot more attention?
Yeah, I mean, and it's frustrating, isn't it? Because if you saw the amount of money going in, and I talked to the Department of Education, they say we are putting more in than other countries. So like, why aren't we getting the outcomes? Why are we getting the outcomes other countries are getting when it comes to disability? I think part of it is, we mainstreamed children with disabilities into schools, and then we just didn't give them the resources. And we were hit with the recession and COVID. We didn't give them resources to actually support children and young people who might have disabilities within the education sector. And we also, I suppose, didn't realise how diverse children are. 1 in 4 children will have a disability, and I've seen it, to be honest, firsthand. I've seen I have a child, and we're going through it at the moment, watching how the school it's dealing with the child. It's just one size fits all. And just doesn't matter if you have an educational assessment. It's just so unsophisticated and poor in terms of they just don't seem to have any ability to do more person-centered approach to education, which is why, you know, centres like the Life Centre in Cork is very successful, because
for sure.
that's what they are doing. And these are children that mightn't have survived in mainstream education for lots of different reasons, but they've survived there and they've gone on to and progressed well in life. So I think that's part of it, you know, and it's not everywhere, because of course it's all down to the leadership and the aptitude and capacity of the staff in the school. But I have seen schools and experienced it firsthand where the school does not take that kind of inclusive approach and is only rolling out the one type of model. And, you know, it really is, you know, really not actually finding alternative ways to support children with additional needs. So big part of it is leadership and how we promote leadership. I mean, I know with my primary school, we'd actually a lot of children with additional needs in the school, and the parents were saying to me the first time I applied, to be said, yes, we're delighted to hear from you. We want to have your child. And, you know, like, and I said, many schools, you applied for 7 schools before this school said yes. And so it goes down to, again, the leadership, the aptitude, the capacity of the schools to take children with disabilities. So I think that's part of the problem. And the approach that we're taking at the moment, you know, is it effective? You know, we actually don't have, I mean, they've said they don't have the capacity to do all the assessments needed. We don't have all the staff needed to give the resources. I think it's mostly going through the SNA route. I just don't think it's working as an approach, and we need to have a fresh take of it. But I would say, from having children, and of course I have a child with a disability, but having children with other disabilities in the school, what was really interesting to see from my children is just the different understanding about children learn in different ways, they communicate in different ways, and they look after each other, and they're part of the group. You can see it actually, mainstreaming is a great success story in our schools and in our communities when it's done well. And when it's not done well, it's a very difficult experience for children and the families living through it. And it really does impact their life chances and where they go next. So I think the government needs to crack it, but they also need to crack why we're spending so much money and not getting the outcomes that children deserve.
For sure. And mainstreaming doesn't suit all children. It's wonderful when it works and is well supported. It's fantastic, but it doesn't suit every child. And then, you know, I know somebody who has a child with a disability. They were promised a school place in September, a child who's 7, and the place still hasn't materialized. I think maybe 2 hours a day in an unsuitable building. And, you know, but the place was promised in September. So it seems like, as far as the department is concerned, that box is ticked. But the experience of that child and their family is far from appropriate.
And you know what's difficult as well to hear when children are getting just the 2 hours here and there and might be near the school or at home, is if when you do the consultations with children about what matters most to them in school, they say friendship. So all those children, they miss out on being friends with people. They actually learn from each other. They do really well as part of a group, and all of that is denied from them. And that is a very difficult part, I think, of growing up in Ireland if you don't have access to a school community, you know.
So we kind of started with what was working well, and then we went into the areas where there are challenges. And just to wrap up, you know, you mentioned you're an optimistic person by nature. You know, where do you think we go now? How do we influence policy to move it up?
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 different areas, I think, which are really important at this moment in time. And I'm thinking about these kind of these big areas where it's going to affect big groups of children. So if you take poverty, for example, a lot of very good people working in government on to address child poverty, particularly in the Department of Taoiseach and across the government departments. We need to keep the focus point and the politicians fixated on addressing child poverty, because the statistics are going in the wrong direction. Now, they'd be far worse if we'd done nothing as a country, and the ESRI has demonstrated that we've got hot school meals, free school books, free GP, all of that actually has helped families, and we'd have much higher rates. So I think there's a real need to keep the national focus for the next 10 years on changing the dial when it comes to child poverty. But when it comes to education, what I'd love to see is a real change in how education is rolled out around the country. And the two directions. One is, this one size fits all. This affects big groups of children from lots of different backgrounds. And there what we need to see is a rethinking of education. There's a national convention that will be taking place next year. The government will be trying to settle on what are the key questions they're going to focus on. And obviously there's big pieces. So is it patronage? Is it going to be around who manages education? Because we don't actually have a management structure in education in Ireland in contrast to other countries. You have the department and the school and no one in between, unless you're an ETB. Or do we dress the one size fits all, and the fact that while education is delivering for lots of young people around the country, there's big sections of the population it's not delivering for. I think I'd love to see that part explored, and I'd love to see that whole approach take place when it comes to reforming education. I'd love to see that every child gets to reach their full potential, no matter what that might be, irrespective of their background. I think that's a key focus for us. And I think the third thing we're going to have to think about is housing. It is across the board having such a negative effect on children and young people. It's contributing to poverty. We've over 5,000 children in homeless accommodation now. We've got a doubling of overcrowded accommodation for families and children, and all of that will have lifelong consequences. These children will not do as well in education. They won't leave school with qualifications. They won't get a good job, and they'll go on to experience housing insecurity themselves. It doesn't have to be this way. The government can make the right decisions, have an approach where they are planning housing for communities, for children and mothers. There's great models in other countries, particularly the Vienna model in Aistear. That's the kind of thing. And the state needs to be actually step up to the plate and actually building the accommodation itself. I mean, those three areas, I think, will have an enormous effect on children and young people across the country. There's loads more, but I think they're the three. If I was to settle on three, they're the three I'd
They're
set.
the three. Tanya, so much. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. We covered a lot, but there's an awful lot more that we could cover. But thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And just to say thank you for all the work you're doing in Early Childhood Ireland to, really safeguard the rights of children in Ireland and early years services, particularly, your work around quality and your work around play and promoting, those ideas for children and young people, and promoting the rights of the workers as well, where we need to see real change.
Thanks, Tanya. And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Ericus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.